Entrepreneur Vivek Ramaswamy argues that corporations have devised an elaborate scam, advertising a hollow fight for social justice in order to reap unprecedented profit and power. Ramaswamy calls this fusion of progressive ideals and capitalism wokenomics. By engaging in wokenomics, corporations go beyond selling a product. They are selling Americans a new standard for the right way to think and live. He contends that their false alliance with social causes allows them to influence legislation, manipulate consumers, and silence dissent. He argues that wokenomics' deceptive practices are weakening democracy, polarizing citizens and concentrating political power in the hands of a small group of corporate elites. After graduating from Harvard and Yale, interning at companies like Goldman Sachs, and founding his own biopharmaceutical company, Roivant Sciences, Ramaswamy claims he has personally witnessed the infiltration of wokenomics and recounts his experiences in this book, Woke Incorporated. Our guide will begin by defining woke and describing its development into wokenomics. Then we'll cover the ways in which Ramaswamy alleges wokenomics to be detrimental to democracy by making America asymmetrically left. Finally, we'll detail the solutions Ramaswamy prescribes for an apolitical Wall Street. Along the way, we'll discuss how Ramaswamy's ideas play into the broader conversations of economics and social movements. What is woke? Ramaswamy uses woke as the summation of all progressive politics, particularly ones regarding marginalized identities. However, the definition of woke has fluctuated over the years. Originally, the word woke was used exclusively in black communities as a steady reminder to be alert to anti-blackness, but it didn't have any particular political affiliation. When the Black Lives Matter movement introduced woke to the mainstream, the use of the word expanded, and people on both sides of the political lines have difficulty agreeing on a precise definition. The meaning of woke ranges from being synonymous with an age of enlightenment, people awakening to the causes of inequity, to an insult of people who are oversensitive and self-important. Cancel culture and political correctness often fall toward this end of the spectrum. Short-form note: the Black Lives Matter (BLM) movement is a response to the accumulating cases of police brutality against black Americans and began after the murder of George Floyd. Because demonstrations were so widespread and conducted largely through social media, premise numbers of participants are hard to pin down, but recent polls suggest that BLM is the largest civil rights protest in American history. Moving away from woke. Linguists indicate that when words broaden in definition, they often lose any real meaning. Ramaswamy frames woke as a term glorified by liberals, but many on the left also question its effectiveness in political discourse. Democratic political consultants like James Carville actively discourage politicians from using woke language in their campaigns, as liberal constituents negatively associate the word with superficial change and conservatives automatically write off such policies as divisive. Why is a woke company harmful? Ramaswamy focuses his criticism on identity politics in the workplace. He argues that by proclaiming to care about race and gender, companies transform into entities that profess to have a sense of morality but which are only using such claims to obscure their true goal of making as much money as possible. How companies take a stance. Throughout this guide, we'll be discussing companies that present themselves as woke or advocates for woke policies. But what are the concrete methods companies use to accomplish this? There are two main ways companies can demonstrate their support for a cause: visually aligning the company with the cause and leveraging money behind the cause. Visual alignment includes tactics like publishing an affirmative statement on social media, including representation in ad campaigns, a homosexual couple in a commercial, a person of color in a magazine spread, and so on. Hiring brand ambassadors who are known activists, signing related petitions, developing a community outreach branch at their company. Leveraging money includes tactics like cutting ties with a business on the opposite side or a state with opposing views, donating to third-party activist groups, openly praising or backing a political candidate. Statistics indicate that these efforts are mostly profitable. While navigating controversy is always risky for a company, its involvement in social issues usually results in a significant boost in consumer approval. The problem of virtue signaling. Ramaswamy's main objection to wokeness is that consumers come to believe that companies are actually invested in resolving social injustice when in reality, they're engaging in disingenuous virtue signaling. Virtue signaling is a public demonstration of good character. For example, when a person volunteers at a charity event, they might post pictures of their service online for other people to see and to think of them as a good person. When an individual engages in virtue signaling, it may be self-serving, but it doesn't do much harm to others. However, when a company participates in virtue signaling, it's a marketing ploy to take advantage of socially conscious consumers and can do harm to a considerably larger number of people. By presenting as woke, companies attempt to accrue enough blind loyalty from consumers that they can distract them from scandal or controversy. For example, after the 2010 BP oil spill, woke consumers were unhappy with how environmentally irresponsible many companies were. Dawn dish soap began an ad campaign in response to the outrage, sending thousands of bottles down to the Gulf of Mexico and running commercials of baby ducks being saved by their product. Dawn became synonymous with wildlife protection efforts. Little ducks still don their bottles a decade later. Ironically, Dawn dish soap is petroleum-based, and their company is part of the reason that we are so dependent on oil. Ramaswamy asserts that once companies like Dawn create this noble reputation for themselves, consumers are not likely to investigate the company's practices or policies further. The trust companies develop turns us into lazy citizens, simply accepting when companies say they are working in our best interest. Better known as wokewashing. Companies using virtue signaling is not new. 18th-century economist and philosopher Adam Smith claimed that virtue signaling becomes necessary as the market grows. When people rely on several different businesses to provide goods and services, it's not feasible for consumers to deeply evaluate the merit of each one, from the quality of their products to the ethics of their practices. Instead, consumers can search for particular indicators. For example, the Better Business Bureau, BBB, rates a business's trustworthiness. If a business gets accredited by the BBB, then consumers know the company has met certain standards and requirements. If a business advertises that the BBB gave them a high rating to garner customers' trust, this is a form of virtue signaling. The problem with using wokeness as virtue signaling is that the concept of woke is so loosely defined and there are no standards for companies to uphold. They can do as little as send a tweet or as much as start their own charities, but both would be considered woke. Social activists already have a term for this specific combination of woke businesses and virtue signaling. Wokewashing is when companies champion social causes while contributing to no meaningful change, or worse, actively making social inequities worse. To contend with wokewashing, advocates hold hypocritical companies accountable through social media and raise awareness through services like the Anti-Racism Daily and Bipartisan on more productive ways to promote change. How did woke become wokenomics? Ramaswamy argues that wokenomics emerged when companies discovered they could boost their profits by claiming to fight for social justice. This discovery came during a significant cultural shift after the 2008 recession. The blame for American inequality moved from economic policy to systemic racism. So-called big business has always been characterized by greed and corruption, and that was true in 2008 when Americans were frustrated and distrustful of banking companies especially. Desperately needing to improve their image, companies learned to capitalize on two key ideas developing at the time: stakeholder capitalism and critical race theory. Companies have long been politically involved. The emergence of stakeholder capitalism and critical race theory indeed correlates with CEOs being more vocal about their beliefs, and Ramaswamy wants to return to a time when capitalists kept these beliefs out of their companies. However, some historians argue that companies were never apolitical, even in regard to social issues. Political journalist Helen Lewis observes that as society evolves, it's almost always more profitable for companies to adapt to new perspectives. With the rise of unions in the 1950s, many factories gave in to the demands to raise wages and improve working conditions for lower-class men. In the 1980s, several companies advocated for affirmative action to the Supreme Court. These corporate decisions aligned with the social movements at the time, but companies weren't viewed as politically radicalizing. Each policy change led to monetary value for the company. Similar to Ramaswamy, Lewis argues that most companies have never had real interest in creating meaningful social reform, but unlike him, she argues that it's because capitalism itself will never be the solution to social equality. Stakeholder capitalism. Ramaswamy argues that wokenomics came of age with the rise of stakeholder capitalism. Under the conventional corporate model, a CEO makes decisions based on the monetary benefit to the business and its shareholders. Stakeholder capitalism adds the consideration of all stakeholders to the mix, so that corporate executives also consider the good of the company's employees and the community in which the company operates when making business decisions. Ramaswamy observed stakeholder capitalism gaining traction after the major banks' irresponsible practices led to the 2008 recession. Banks made loans to people who could not afford to pay them off, and after their actions came to light, the public began to question how we can prevent the same mistakes from happening again. Stakeholder capitalism provided an answer. Theoretically, if companies valued people and community as much as they did their money, then they would not exploit their customers again. How does stakeholder capitalism benefit companies? Besides improving consumer trust, there are other profitable reasons for companies to buy into stakeholder capitalism. When companies invest money into social causes, their business becomes indispensable. If a company creates a community program, consumers and politicians know that the program loses funding if the company goes under. Companies that support social causes attract a new generation of workers. Generation Z in particular has come to value social responsibility. The young people who are active in their community and knowledgeable about political issues will most likely be the most innovative and intelligent employees entering the workforce. If an employee feels passionately about social causes, they will dedicate time and energy toward those causes. When a company provides a way for an employee to fulfill this passion, then their efforts can be spent at work instead of through other organizations. Similarly, consumers who care about social issues can develop a sense of loyalty to a company and tend to be vocal about their approval online. Social media is necessary for the growth of a company but notoriously tricky to navigate. A devoted customer base can help protect companies from potential PR mistakes or cancel culture. Premium products that support social causes justify higher prices. The move toward social consciousness was also reinforced by the government's response to the banks' misconduct. After the recession, the government required banks to pay fines, with the intention of using those funds to help the people who fell on hard times. However, the Department of Justice also offered an alternative. If companies didn't want to pay the fine, they could donate to an approved list of non-profits for a lesser amount of money with the usual tax deductions. Many corporations took advantage of this, and as a result, diverted funds that would have otherwise directly helped the American people. In addition, they generated positive publicity for being socially conscious. For example, after the recession, Bank of America ironically began a fund for nonprofits that aided in establishing financial stability through homebuyer education, budgeting, and other related programs. Ramaswamy declares that through the rising popularity of stakeholder capitalism, corporations gained a larger say in our political discourse. Because corporations have money and recognition beyond the average citizen, their political influence can potentially outweigh that of an American citizen. Limitations of stakeholder capitalism. Ramaswamy argues that unless consumers stop demanding sustainable and inclusive business practices, stakeholder capitalism is going to become the norm in our economy. Other political commentators agree with him, warning of significant limitations to the benefits of such a system. Realistically, companies have finite resources to use on social causes. How companies will choose which cause to prioritize is unclear. It may be tempting for companies to choose easier or less significant social causes so that they can appear socially conscious without having to invest much effort into more difficult change. When companies face financial hardship, the social causes they support will suffer. If our society becomes too reliant on companies to fight social causes, economic recessions can intensify the threats to high-risk communities. Some advocates of stakeholder capitalism recommend that companies committed to social justice should take the time to educate themselves on the best ways to generate positive change and to avoid becoming monopolies through partnerships with other organizations. It's also important to note that many activists such as Malcolm X and Fred Hampton argue that capitalism is inherently predatory, and social equality is not compatible with any capitalist system. Critical race theory. Ramaswamy claims wokenomics also coincided with the emergence of critical race theory, CRT, which centers racism as the blame for inequalities in America. CRT is an academic concept created by a group of lawyers and legal scholars in the 1990s. Their main principle is that race was a fundamental part of the conception of America, for example, through the genocide of indigenous peoples and the enslavement of black people. And since the Constitution was created within this context of severe racial divide, lawyers can't assume the legal system is neutral and must recognize the ways in which racism still operates in our legislation. Short-form note. In its original academic context, CRT isn't meant to be used in isolation. It's one of many approaches activists advise be used to analyze legislation or other social structures, depending on the field that adapts the theory. Kimberly Crenshaw, one of the lawyers credited with CRT, emphasized the importance of intersectionality, the understanding that people have different identities, of which race is just one, and which can overlap but are still distinct. For example, while a poor, black woman may share some experiences as a black, transgender man because of their race, they will also have dissimilarities due to their unique identities. However, Ramaswamy compares the belief in systemic racism to accepting a racial caste system, in which some groups have more rights and advantages than others. He doesn't believe such a caste-like system exists in America and that woke people pressing for diverse inclusion are actually vying for extra privileges they didn't earn. He is particularly against prioritizing inclusion in the workplace, as it may lead companies to hire people based on their identities instead of their qualifications. Short-form note. American journalist Isabel Wilkerson also compares systemic racism in America to a caste system in her book Caste. She argues that similar to caste systems in other countries, groups of people are granted certain privileges while others are disenfranchised, and this dichotomy is upheld by legislation and social norms. However, her solution to breaking the caste system is not to deny its existence but to examine the ways in which the racial structure is maintained and fight against it. What does wokenomics in practice look like? Ramaswamy writes that a company engaging in any way with progressive values is woke and strays from his ideal of apolitical capitalism. He highlights what he contends are the worst ways that wokenomics is applied to American society, including diversity training and censorship, boycotting, and submitting to foreign, undemocratic countries. Diversity training and censorship. Ramaswamy contends that diversity training is a way for a company to inflate its efforts of making internal changes while never having to implement any actual practices. These trainings often teach about sexual harassment, LGBTQ+ inclusion, or anti-racist practices. While they may have some educational value for employees, they do not guarantee that the company will hire more marginalized identities, create safe spaces for them, nor donate to related causes. Short-form note. To be clear, Ramaswamy isn't suggesting that companies reconcile this disconnect between what they say they do and what they actually do by changing their actual hiring practices and inclusion policies. His argument is that such policies are unnecessary because prioritizing a workforce of diverse identities isn't needed to make a company successful. He recommends, instead, that they simply stop pretending they're making these changes. He argues that diversity training not only allows companies to avoid making real change, but it also leads to other harms. It silences dissenting voices both at work and outside of the workplace, and it diverts resources from more effective avenues of reform. Silencing dissenting voices at work. Corporate executives use diversity training to force their ideals on workers and pressure them to conform. Employees with dissenting views might be afraid of losing their jobs if they voice their opinion. For example, if a company installs new, single-stall, gender-neutral bathrooms, employees who may not agree with that decision might not want to voice opposing opinions lest they be met with backlash. Short-form note. Human resources experts advise that to create an environment in which workers feel comfortable expressing their views while at the same time promoting diversity and inclusion, companies should clearly define the difference between opinion and harassment, which can include discrimination or hate speech. They should also emphasize the importance of fostering respect among co-workers, not just diversity. Silencing dissenting voices outside the workplace. When corporations market their use of diversity training to appear woke, they'll often forbid their employees from expressing an unwoke idea on social media, outside the workplace, because it mars their public image. Take Interactive Corp employee Justine Stucco, who famously tweeted about her whiteness making her immune to catching AIDS in Africa and was subsequently fired because Interactive didn't want to employ someone considered racist. Ramaswamy argues that the company shouldn't have fired her, as employees should be able to say what they want in their private time and spaces. The consequence of cancel culture. In So You've Been Publicly Shamed, journalist John Ronson explains that while cancel culture may have begun with good intentions, the consequences of canceling someone can be destructive. Cancel culture is a phenomenon in which people direct mass disapproval towards someone in an attempt to punish them for offensive speech or behaviors. The medium in which cancel culture occurs is almost always social media. Social media gives power to voices that have historically been stifled or ignored. Activists can use social media to exert enough pressure to take down titans like Harvey Weinstein, who was so well connected in Hollywood, few people dared to speak against him. The #MeToo movement empowered women victimized by him to speak out and bring him to justice. However, Ronson explains that the unregulated nature of cancel culture means that the power can easily be abused. When a person is fired or accused of a crime, they are usually given some form of due process, but cancel culture sentences people immediately and severely. While public figures like Weinstein might have the resources to defend themselves, everyday people like Justine Stucco, of Ramaswamy's discussion, won't, and it can strip them of their job, friends, and social standing. This form of justice is arbitrary and at times disproportionate to the perceived transgression. Ronson reiterates that positive social change cannot stem from this kind of cancel culture. Diverting resources for more effective avenues of reform. Companies often deploy expensive diversity training directly after a major controversy or social outcry. This trend suggests that companies are only using the training to put on a performance of demonstrating that they've taken measures towards social good. Ramaswamy argues that if companies actually want to make positive social changes, they should focus on making better products instead. For example, if a company that makes women's fitness apparel came under scrutiny for sexism in the workplace, Ramaswamy asserts that training on anti-sexism would be less beneficial than focusing on creating a product that helps women everywhere. Ineffective diversity training. Daniel Goleman, psychologist and author of Emotional Intelligence, agrees with Ramaswamy's assessment that most diversity workshops don't create legitimate social change within a company or society. However, Goleman contends that implementing true social change does bring benefits. Companies gain a competitive advantage by employing people from a variety of different backgrounds. Furthermore, for these diverse companies to foster productive employees and create better products, prejudice in the workplace needs to be taken seriously. A company can't function efficiently if employees don't believe the workplace is a safe environment for them. For inclusion efforts to be meaningful, Goleman argues that companies can't just mandate a diversity training session that lasts for a day or weekend. This short time span makes the exercise seem like an inconsequential hoop to jump through. Additionally, discussing issues like racism or sexism can be emotionally taxing for employees, and a superficial meeting doesn't justify bringing up such intense emotions. Goleman suggests that corporations should instead establish long-term, company norms that foster a cooperative environment. Boycotting. Activists looking to bring about change will sometimes encourage consumers to boycott a company they deem isn't woke enough. Boycotts might seem productive and empowering to the woke consumer in the short term, but Ramaswamy claims that politically motivated boycotts can hurt poor consumers and are a wasted effort in the long run. Boycotts can punish poor consumers. Some people can't afford to quit certain brands if the more woke options are more expensive. For example, woke activists may urge people to boycott Amazon because of the poor working conditions in their factories, but few companies can compete with the range and speed at which Amazon can provide products, and consumers who rely on their services might be shamed for continuing to buy from Amazon or feel pressured into spending more money on alternative options. Ramaswamy's solution is that if consumers who don't face poverty disapprove of Amazon's business practices, they should donate to nonprofits that address the specific issues or try to open a new business that challenges Amazon. Boycotts are frequently unsuccessful. It's difficult to measure how many consumers will have to withhold their money to overcome loyal patrons and for how long boycotters will have to endure. For example, when Chick-fil-A's CEO made a public statement against gay marriage, activists boycotted the company nationwide. However, enough people continued to eat there that the chain outlived the boycott. Furthermore, even when a boycott is successful, the accomplishment is a net negative from Ramaswamy's perspective because consumers are forcing businesses to engage with wokenomics and repeat the cycle of virtue signaling. Boycotts should not be the center of activism. Law professor Zephyr Teachout argues that boycotting is a legitimate form of ethical consumerism and, contrary to Ramaswamy's argument, can be effective. If enough consumers decide to quit buying from a company, that company might be motivated to change its business practices. The Montgomery bus boycott, for example, in which segregation was barred from public transport after Rosa Parks inspired customers to protest for over a year, is evidence that sometimes mass protests can be crucial to social change. However, Teachout also warns against making boycotts the main method of protest. The emphasis on boycotting makes it the consumer's responsibility to hold companies accountable, which can place a difficult burden on an individual's shoulders, as Ramaswamy points out in his discussion of its effect on poor people. Instead, Teachout agrees with Ramaswamy's argument that social coalitions and non-profits are much better suited to pressure corporations from a variety of angles. He asserts that activists should prioritize efforts to make these organizations stronger. Submitting to foreign countries. According to Ramaswamy, the deceptive nature of wokenomics amplifies the corruption between American corporations and foreign governments. In global capitalism, companies often seek to maximize their profits by partnering with countries that have fewer regulations on valuable resources like raw materials and labor. Ramaswamy argues that wokenomics distracts consumers from these unethical partnerships. When buying from woke companies, consumers believe they're supporting an advocate for human rights, but wokenomics doesn't compel companies to be transparent about their overseas dealings. Ramaswamy argues that because wokenomics creates trust between the company and the consumer, customers may not be motivated to investigate a business's international practices if they already believe the company to be morally sound. Woke companies' dishonest conduct, therefore, leads to many consumers unknowingly supporting actions that contradict the very ideas they believe in. For example, even though Starbucks advertised its socially responsible mission statement and anti-racist training programs, it has 5 plantations in Brazil that use child and slave labor under dismal working conditions. Forgetting a company's misdeeds. Studies show that consumers remember ethical corporate behavior better than unethical behavior. When it comes to the news or personal memories, people tend to retain negative information better, but researchers hypothesize that people retain positive memories of companies because they prefer to ignore negative behavior that might conflict with their desire to buy a product or spend their leisure time without thinking about serious political issues. Woke companies can use this tendency to their advantage. The average American consumer isn't up to date on international news, and if controversy does surface, companies can drown it out with reports of all of their good deeds until most people forget the scandals. Using trust to buy data. Ramaswamy argues that trusting a woke company's integrity not only leads to consumers indirectly financing human rights violations in other countries, but also keeps consumers in the dark when foreign governments leverage their invaluable resources to demand access to our personal data. Ramaswamy warns that the Chinese Communist Party, CCP, in particular, is collecting our personal data to potentially misuse it. Ramaswamy describes Airbnb as the epitome of abusing consumers' trust. Airbnb emphasizes how much they value their stakeholders, even replacing traditionally exclusive shareholder events with a stakeholder day. However, Airbnb shares an immense amount of its customers' private data with the CCP, including phone numbers and email addresses, neglecting to inform the American public that the CCP is one of their largest and most powerful stakeholders. Information in the wrong hands. Some political commentators believe that the United States and other democratic countries should take more proactive measures to prevent the CCP from mining data. The CCP uses intense surveillance through technological devices to maintain social order in China. They monitor private communication, web searches, and the whereabouts of Chinese citizens. As Ramaswamy described, Airbnb has shared comparably personal information with the CCP. While it might be unclear what China would do with customer information for a temporary lodging company, in 2021, the CCP's intentions became more clear when they were reported to have new software designed to gather and categorize negative press shared on social media sites like Twitter and Facebook. This kind of surveillance could endanger the lives of professors, journalists, or politicians who speak out against the government. Using trust to buy media presence. The CCP can also use its outsized influence to pressure media companies to present their political values in a favorable light to American audiences. For example, film production companies have frequently had to censor their movies to appease the CCP. Adjustments range from subtle, like the adaptation of the book World War Z changing the plot point in which China was the place of origin for the zombie virus, to overt, like the DreamWorks movie Abominable using a map that depicted disputed lands as part of China. As the CCP inserts itself into American pop culture, Ramaswamy worries that ordinary citizens may be swayed into viewing China less critically, again because they're dissuaded from questioning the partnership between woke media companies, which they trust, and foreign governments. The CCP as a codependent partner. There's no easy way for American companies to detach themselves from China. China wants to compete in the global market and provides alluring incentives for Western companies to contribute to their market and development. However, as Ramaswamy notes, one of the stipulations of having China as a partner is that the CCP will not accept any criticism and quickly punishes companies that don't comply. Even though companies are aware of the CCP's transgressions, halting business with China would steeply reduce their profit and cause everyday goods to be more expensive for American citizens. Political figures like Robert Daley warn of another looming problem. As China begins to build up its own infrastructure, technology, and capital, it will depend less on American companies while our reliance on it remains the same. This imbalance will lead to a power dynamic that might permit the CCP even more influence over American companies and citizens. How do we solve wokenomics? Ramaswamy believes the antidote to wokenomics is a paradigm shift. He believes that Americans need to redefine strong values so that they cannot be influenced by wokeness or any other political ideology in the future. Ramaswamy paves the road to reclaiming our political power with 5 actionable solutions. Solution 1. Revise Section 230. Ramaswamy argues that if we don't limit the unique privileges granted to tech companies, those companies will essentially function as a shadow government ruling over the free speech of American citizens. To do this, he says we should restructure the Common Decency Act, CDA, which was established in 1996 to prevent minors from accessing pornographic material on the Internet but has ended up giving tech companies unusual powers of censorship in addition to unusual freedom from liability. Under Section 230 of the CDA, if a user posts explicit content on social media, the tech provider for that website can neither be held liable for the post nor sued for removing it. This protection gives them enormous power. They can both permit and remove content as they like with no repercussions. Ramaswamy argues that this gives tech companies the power to interpret our laws and censor our citizens according to their own guidelines, which may or may not align with official legal guidelines. Ramaswamy's solution is an amendment to Section 230 in which social media companies have to choose between one of the 2 legal protections. If they choose to moderate people's opinions, they'll then be liable for the spread of illegal content. In other words, if they're going to remove problematic content, they must commit to removing all problematic content. If, on the other hand, they choose to allow complete freedom of speech, then they can't remove any content that they decide doesn't fit their guidelines, but they'll be protected from litigation. Short-form note: the debate over Section 230 is a hot topic in conservative circles, and party members are divided on whether or not to revise the legislation. Some agree with Ramaswamy, believing that the revisions proposed would pressure media companies to create fairer and more transparent user guidelines. Others argue that as big tech companies are a part of the market, the government would be overstepping in trying to further regulate how they run their business. People on this side of the debate maintain that when censoring users' voices becomes unprofitable, then these companies will stop on their own. Solution 2. Consider political affiliation as freedom of religion. Ramaswamy argues that free speech can be strengthened by adding political affiliation to the freedoms protected by the First Amendment. He writes that since political affiliation is such a predominant part of people's identities and how they live their lives, it's equivalent to following a religion. Thus, just as religion is protected, people should not be discriminated against based on how they define themselves politically. Not IRS approved. A person's political leanings can impact their perspective of the world and how they choose to live their life, but there are more conditions that need to be met before a belief system can be recognized as a religion. The Internal Revenue Code, IRS, determines the tax status of organizations such as nonprofits and churches, and political affiliation does not meet many of the qualifications for religious protections and exemptions. Political parties don't have a distinct creed and structure of worship. Neither the liberal nor conservative parties can claim universal principles or a uniform way in which those principles are applied in practice. Political parties don't have a sacred text that outlines the rules of their doctrine. Political parties don't have ordained ministers. We elect representatives to communicate our interests in the federal government. It's not general practice for the leaders of a political party to preach what to believe to their constituents. Solution 3. Mandate community service. To combat a cultural admiration of wokeness, Ramaswamy suggests a national community service mandate in which all adolescents must participate during their 4 summers of high school. Ramaswamy notes some benefits this would provide, such as combating the summer retention deficiency students face and generating a sense of patriotism similar to countries that mandate military service. The most important part of his idea, though, is the role it plays in the paradigm shift Ramaswamy is after. He notes that currently, many students do community service as resume boosters, but Ramaswamy considers this a form of virtue signaling. However, if all students participated in community service, young people could focus on actually helping their communities instead of getting a competitive advantage. They might find causes that they genuinely care about and continue to support these causes themselves instead of handing the responsibility over to a corporation. Community service isn't free. While few would argue against the benefits of young people getting involved in their communities, people in the world of education have doubts as to how such a mandate would be enforced. Such responsibility would most likely fall on schools, which range drastically in the amount and quality of resources each district has. Without addressing inequities in the education system, a community service mandate risks creating yet another means of power imbalance. Students cannot volunteer without necessary resources. To participate in such a program, students would need access to things like transportation and a safe place in the community to serve. Mandated community service programs would also be a financial hardship for students who must work over the summer to support their families, and they would disadvantage students who participate in summer programs like sports or band in efforts to win non-academic scholarships. Solution 4. Replace critical race theory with critical diversity theory. To contest critical race theory and the diversity training it inspires, Ramaswamy proposes the development of critical diversity theory, CDT. CDT would entail collaboration between academics and corporations to create new assessments for determining diversity. Diversity under CDT would measure different experiences and ways of thinking instead of inherited traits like skin color and sex. CDT would also allow flexibility for companies to define which diverse traits are important to them. For example, some companies may want diversity of thought when it comes to creativity but not when it comes to punctuality. Why the name matters. Although Ramaswamy argues that CRT should be replaced by CDT because CRT promises to fix what he claims is a false problem, ingrained racism affecting all aspects of American life, data does support the principal tenet of CRT that unexamined racism leads to unfair inequalities. The The Justice Department's recent attempt to eradicate racial bias from legal practice exemplifies how ingrained racism can be. Pattern is an artificial intelligence (AI) program created to impartially assess how likely a prisoner is to repeat a crime and their level of risk returning to society. Ultimately, the AI began to duplicate the discrimination of its human predecessors, disproportionately marking black and brown people as high risk and prohibiting their release. The American Civil Liberties Union (ACLU) warned criminal justice systems against relying on AI, as people can pass on their bias to the algorithm. While merging all differences as diversity is inclusive, activists emphasize the importance of being specific in terminology when trying to solve complicated problems like racism. Solution 5. Entrust social issues to non-profits. Ramaswamy says that all social issues should be relegated to non-profits and government organizations, leaving capitalist entities completely apolitical. For this to work, he explains that Americans must have faith that companies with no political influence will naturally come to align themselves with our social values. Let's use vapes to illustrate this idea. Although many had hoped that vaping would reduce nicotine addiction among young people, studies are beginning to show that it actually increases addiction. Woke consumers may be tempted to fix this issue by demanding that companies make socially responsible changes like removing the versions sold to teens or starting ad campaigns advocating for teen health. However, companies aren't going to want to lose a large portion of their consumer base and will probably resort to shady tactics to keep marketing to young people anyway. Ramaswamy claims that if consumers put their money toward nonprofits, for example, ones that educate and assist teens who vape, we have a greater chance of raising a generation of young people who will do the right thing, like having no desire to vape. Thus, the vaping companies of this example would come to a natural end. Necessary changes to non-profits. Experts note that if our society is to rely on non-profits to promote social change, there must be measures in place to prevent fraudulent or ineffective use of resources. Harvard business professor Regina E. Herzlinger recommends a system in which non-profits must make their financial statements transparent to the public, are assessed for the quality and quantity of community efforts, have sanctions applied if they fail to disclose their records or misuse donations.